Thank you so much. We are so excited to be here to really talk about the importance of racial and social justice in addiction research for the College on Problems of Drug Dependence. I am really just enamored and excited to speak alongside some of really the real heavy hitters in the field, Dr. Latrice Montgomery, who is a research associate professor and clinical psychologist at the University of Cincinnati, and also Dr. Angela Haney, who is an assistant professor and clinical psychologist at the Yale School of Medicine. Before I begin my portion of the talk, I always like to acknowledge the land on which I'm giving this talk. And this is something that I've started to do more recently, really thinking about land acknowledgements in terms of actualizing and acknowledging that the land in which we do research and give talks is indeed native land. And so we have to be present and really be deliberate in giving thanks to the native people who have stewarded this land for generations. And where I'm in New Haven, Connecticut, and that's the land of 7 tribes of indigenous people who have stewarded this land throughout generations. I deliberately thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land. Remembering that land acknowledgements don't exist just in the past tense or historical context, but that colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to be mindful of our present participation. And I think that's important as we're thinking about racial and social justice and addiction. How are we consciously or unconsciously perpetuating oppression? This is important, and we hope to shed some light on that topic today. I do not have any conflicts of interest. The objectives of my talk are threefold. One, I'm going to briefly highlight the sociopolitical factors that contribute to the existence and propagation of health disparities amongst BIPOC populations, and that stands for Black, Indigenous, persons of color. I'm going to highlight the ongoing disparities that we continue to see in the field of NIH-funded research. And then I hope to end with providing some hope in terms of some of the innovative research that myself, Dr. Montgomery, and Dr. Haney are doing in terms of really interrogating and promoting racial and social justice and addiction. So what do we know about the current landscape? We know it's terrible, that it's nothing that we haven't seen. And so when we look at terms of the statistics, white people use alcohol at the same or greater rates than Black or Latinx populations. However, the latter populations actually have worsening alcohol-related illness and negative sequelae. For instance, this is just one example: Latinx with higher DUI, driving under the influence fatalities. There's a higher rate of cocaine-related overdose deaths amongst Black and Latinx populations compared with white people. Why is that the case? It has nothing to do with Black or Latinx people per se. I hope to convince you that it has a lot to do with racism and structural racism. And I always say racism, not race, accounts for these differences. If we look at non-medical cannabis use, and this is something Dr. Montgomery will talk about in more detail, it's decreased for all people, but in terms of actually having a cannabis use disorder among adults, if we look at Black, Native, and Latinx populations compared with white people, they have higher rates of cannabis use disorder. Why is that the case? Black people in particular, compared with other racial and ethnic groups, are more likely to have substance-related disability and premature death, and more likely to suffer negative drug-related consequences, including infectious disease rates like hepatitis C and HIV. And because of really deliberate policies rooted in the war on drugs, which we know has real negative consequences for Black and Latinx populations, these BIPOC communities have a higher rate of involvement in the legal system. So one of the reasons that underscores all this is really inequities in health that really is from the social determinants of health. So what do we mean by that? These are avoidable health inequalities that arise because of the circumstances in which people grow, live, work, and age. And I think what's important to understand about SDOH, social determinants of health, is that these are inequities really based in structural racism, and I'll show you a slide on that, and that these are in fact avoidable. So that if we are very deliberate in addressing SDOH in terms of our research, we can, and in fact, really be able to close the gap on health disparities. So I think one of the things that I want to just bring attention to is we focus so much in terms of the end of the game, right? The disparities. This is a BIPOC person with a substance use disorder, SUD. And so much of our time is spent at the end, right? But what I hope that you'll understand from our presentation today is that there are all these inequities in the social determinants of health that really affect the way in which people are able to engage with the addiction system, but also thinking about how can our research systematically address some of these social determinants of health so that we are not setting ourselves up for further widening disparities in addiction. Another thing that exists in terms of why we're seeing these disparities that's a part of these social determinants of health is this concept of othering. And what do I mean by that? This is a concept, if you look it up in the dictionary, it just says othering really is to, or to other, is to view or treat a person or group of people different or alien to oneself. So one of the things that has happened in addiction research is that BIPOC communities have been left out of the conversation. And there's really a focus on whiteness. Even with the opioid crisis, a lot of the money has been focused on opioids now because there was a considerable negative consequence in white communities, really minimizing the ways in which Asian communities were affected by opium, right? And the ways in which Black communities were affected by heroin in the 1960s and 70s. And so when you other folks and leave them out of the conversation, that really does affect who gets care and even where research dollars are spent. So we know that othering has resulted in limited focus on funding for addiction research that specifically affects BIPOC communities or treatment modalities. We know that Black applicants in particular are more likely to propose research topics that are less likely to be funded. So we have to take a look inward and see how does our greater research system actually promote othering and make it more difficult for researchers from BIPOC communities to do the work to eliminate health disparities. I want to bring us into the consciousness of racism and realizing that we can't talk about health disparities and addiction if we don't also talk about racism as a social determinant of health. And there are many different ways in which we talk about racism. And I like the definition from Dr. Jones. I encourage you all to look up the reference below, but she describes 3 different levels: institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism, and internalized racism. And the way in which we conduct research really goes through all of these different levels. So if we look at institutionalized racism, differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race, that's looking at how do we have policies that make it more difficult to actually conduct research that's going to benefit minority communities. So that's looking at the review process for grants, right? At an institutional level, if we focus on personally mediated racism, that's the differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others based on race. And some examples of that are, what we're seeing in the mainstream media related to Black people automatically being vilified as a result of their substance use and not being a reason to create harm, right? And we're seeing that quite publicly with what's happening with George Floyd, demonizing him and his substance use as a reason to create him as dangerous, as opposed to thinking, what are the ways in which we can help someone like him who has a opioid use disorder in the same way that we would for white people. And then finally, internalized racism, acceptance by the stigmatized races of the negative messages about your own abilities and strengths. And I think in terms of recovery, this is so important, because how can we empower people to want to take better care of themselves or to participate in our research trials if they have already accepted that they're never going to be able to do well or initiate, recovery because of all the negative images that they've been socialized to believe. So those are really the sociopolitical structures that I wanted to cover. Next, I want to go into what does the literature show in terms of who is actually being funded to do research, right? And so this is an example of institutionalized racism. And I'm going to break it down just so everybody sees the data. People say, Dr. Jordan, show me the data. Here it goes. Back in, this was published in 2011. There was a seminal paper in Science that looks at race, ethnicity, and NIH research awards. And it shows that Black applicants are 13.2 percentage points and Asian applicants 3.9 percentage points less likely to receive funding compared with white people. So then people always say, what have you controlled for all the different confounders that might make this so? Absolutely. So even when we control for things like educational background, country of origin, training, publication record, previous research awards, Black applicants remain 10% less than white people to be awarded research funding. More bad news. We know that Black and Asian investigators are less likely to be awarded an R01 on their first or second attempt. The problem is that Black and Hispanic investigators are less likely to resubmit a revised application. So even if they're not funded, it makes it even more difficult because they're less likely, thinking about that concept of internalized racism, thinking you're not good enough, to resubmit a revised application. And then for Black investigators that actually do resubmit, they have to do so more often in order to receive an award. So I present this so that people can understand the way in which our systems systematically exclude people from being able to do the work. Also, this came out in 2019, so 8 years after that seminal paper in Science, where it says, research topic preference contributes to persistent funding gap in NIH research grants for Black scientists. So still, in 9 years, we didn't learn anything because there continues to be a 20% funding gap for Black scientists applying for NIH R01 grants compared with white people. And in this paper, they go through all of the points on why this is the case. What was interesting, again, still thinking about ways in which structural racism shows up. In the paper, they never discussed racism. They talked about impact score based on topic choice. They talked about maybe the methodology proposed by Black scientists are not as rigorous, intimating that somehow they wouldn't be able to put forth as rigorous of a methodology, but no one talked about how racism might actually influence this. So one of the things that Dr. Hart and I were able to do is we said, let's be clear. We have to be deliberate in calling out racism in action, because that results to a disproportionate system that unfairly disadvantages others. In this case, it's Black scientists. And that's important to note because we know Black scientists are more likely to investigate topics such as racism that leads to health disparities because they are more disproportionately affected by them. So instead of shying away from racism and the ways in which it's integrated into all of our research paradigms, we need to think about solutions and be thoughtful in how that we're able to move forward. In the last 5 minutes before I turn it over to Dr. Montgomery, I'd like to think about one potential solution, right? I want to have an honest and open conversation about the reality of where we are and our research complex structure, but also offer some hope and ways forward. So one of the ways, a physician scientist, that I think about this is through a community-based participatory research approach. And CBPR employs a partnership that equitably involves all community members, key stakeholders, in my case, it's Black people with substance use disorders, researchers in all aspects of the research process, from the beginning, the very question itself, to how the research is going to be executed. And I'm really excited because this is the R01 that was just funded by NIAAA, the National Institutes of Alcoholism and Alcohol Use, a feasibility study providing substance use treatment in the Black church. So we just published our pilot results, and here I'm showing you the pastor from the church where we have the evidence-based treatment actually supported and was a part of the community discussions at the beginning in terms of what does this experiment need to look like? How do we design it in a way that will promote Black people with addiction to actually engage? This is the mayor. We had huge support. And these are the two research assistants. It was really important that the research assistants reflect the community that we serve. This is Kim Guy and Richard Ewens, who are both in recovery from cocaine and opioid use disorder. I'll go through this quickly, but basically what I'm showing is that most of the people that were involved in this research project had inequities in the social determinants of health, right? That 28% did not complete high school. 8% were employed. So the majority of them were not employed. And most of them had never been married or were living alone. So that's social isolation. So it's important for us in this project to not only address the substance use, which is important, but really think about how can we intervene at the social determinants of health in order for them to be well. And one of the ways that we did this is through a certification appointment, so that once they were able to gain skills through the research project, we actually had a graduation that could certify what skills they use that they can later have for employment. So these are kind of the ways, creative ways we have to think about conducting research. Another research program that we're doing with Sherelle Bellamy, who is a research scientist and psychologist, is Imani Breakthrough. And again, Imani means faith in Swahili. That's the name that was given to us by the Black and Latinx participants in this program. But basically, it takes place over 6 months. We focus on not just substance use, that's important, but how can we empower people, really addressing at the level of internalized racism, to want to initiate recovery? What are the roles, responsibilities, relationships, resources, and rights that they need to know to want to even initiate or participate in addiction treatment? So much of our focus is about that. I'm showing you that integrated into the referral to traditional substance use treatment is we have peer recovery coaches that identify inequities in the 8 dimensions of wellness. And the next part of the project is really 10 weeks, in addition to their substance use treatment, to focus on how can we get you employed? How can we remove the misdemeanor from your record that prevents you from getting housing? All of this has to be implemented within the research that we do. And I'll end with this. In order for us to move forward with promoting racial and social justice, there has to be 3 main areas of focus within research itself. One, we have to be very deliberate in having culturally informed collection methods to actually reflect the prevalence rates. And Dr. Haney and I worked on a review paper that just came out in Harvard Review of Psychiatry, looking at opioid use in Black communities. And one of the things that we found from the current epidemiological surveys is they do not use language that is highly utilized in Black communities, so that there might be an underreporting of substance use just based on that alone. So we have to be very deliberate in that. Second is that we have to fund research, and more specifically BIPOC researchers that specifically address the importance of culture in accessing treatment. And these wonderful researchers are going to give you some examples of that. So we can't shy away from how institutionalized racism shows up in our selection of research. And I think that the National Institutes of Health is being very deliberate now in doing this through their initiatives. And then finally, we have to be more systematic in terms of directly studying how inequities in this, or not inequities, but the social determinants themselves can improve or exacerbate health outcomes. If we look at poverty, if we look at insecurity and food access, how does that exacerbate health outcomes, and what research can we do to minimize that? Finally, I'd like to just end with one of my research mentors who has been tremendous in helping me unapologetically find my voice in the research space, Kathy Carroll. I know that she is a beloved, or was a beloved member of CPDD, and she unexpectedly died last year. So with her legacy in mind, I am so grateful to have given this talk, but really, and just want to thank her for her compassionate leadership and excellent scientific rigor, because she has allowed me to really prosper and grow in my own research career. So with that, please check us out on all the socials, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Montgomery.
Perfect, there we are. Thank you so much, Dr. Jordan, for that wonderful presentation and for also inviting me to be a member on this wonderful workshop focusing specifically on social justice. So as you noted, my name is Dr. Latrice Montgomery. I'm a research associate professor and clinical psychologist at the University of Cincinnati. And today I want to focus my talk specifically on cannabis, social justice, and Black America. Now, as you'll see with this map, and as we know, that the laws and policies regarding cannabis have evolved significantly over the past few decades, whether it be legalizing medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, or having some states that are decriminalizing marijuana in some way. And it's my job as a researcher, and especially as a Black researcher, to ensure that as the colors on this map change, that our voices are continuing to be heard and represented. And that is what my primary goal is. And so one thing I want to note is that we probably are all very familiar with statistics regarding cannabis use in Black people. So for example, we probably all know that Black people are more likely to be arrested for cannabis-related offenses than white people. But there are also some disparities that you may not be aware of. And this is where a lot of my research comes in, and some of the things that I'm focusing on becomes really important. So for example, as we look at this map and we think about legalization, there are some studies, although small in number and restricted to California, that have found that there are certain areas where medical marijuana dispensaries are higher, particularly in communities that have higher proportion of African-American residents. And on top of that, there are some dispensaries that are specifically targeting and identifying and targeting recreational cannabis users, especially young Black males. So there's all this information about spatial distribution of dispensaries as well as marketing practices. So we have to ensure that as this legalization landscape is changing, and we have to ensure that our Black voices are not left out of this, and that we understand how we might be impacted by some of these laws. And of course, that doesn't even get to the disparities related to the business side of cannabis, which I could do a whole other presentation on that. But just again, just wanting to paint the picture for the disparities that we see in this space. And so in my area of research, what I'm particularly interested in is not only just looking more broadly at cannabis use among Black people and just kind of spouting out random statistics about, what Black people are doing or not doing as it relates to cannabis use, but really looking at specifics. What are the patterns of use? What are the reasons for use? What is the context for use? And also understanding how Black people in particular, especially young Black adults, are targeted in some ways, and how we might be able to put appropriate interventions in place to ensure that this does not continue to happen. So in my quest to understand more deeply about cannabis use among Black people, I have found and others in this space that the mode of use is different. And so Dr. Jordan mentioned, for example, that cannabis use disorder tends to be a bit higher among certain racial ethnic minority groups, including Black people. And so we know that information, but part of that reasoning is related to some things that I found in my studies related to blunt use. So even though when we look at cannabis use rates overall, they tend to be pretty consistent across racial ethnic groups, when we look at types of use, we note that Black people are more likely to use blunts than other groups. And blunts are hollowed out little cigars and cigarillos that are, remove the tobacco and replace it with cannabis, roll it back up and smoke it. And so this is a very common mode, and I won't get into all the reasons of why that is, but it's a very common mode. And I think it's important for us to have this information because it helps us to get deeper into the conversation of not only understanding that there are disparities, but we might begin to then figure out why those disparities exist and what specific types of products we might actually target in our interventions. And related to that, we also noted in baseline data, we did a secondary analysis of a clinical trial that was conducted in the NIDA CTN. And what we found is that blunt users who presented to treatment were more likely to report higher levels of cannabis use in the past month, as well as more intense withdrawal symptoms, particularly physiological and mood withdrawal symptoms. So again, just areas that we know we need to focus on, especially among young Black people. And without this specific focus on Black people in our research, this information will be completely lost. And then we sit back and wonder why interventions aren't necessarily working. And so we have to make sure that we are targeting these areas and particularly focusing on folks who are experiencing the disparities the most. And in this case, it's Black people. Another area that we focused on, we did a scoping review and meta-analysis of treatments for both cannabis and tobacco among African Americans. And a lot of this gets back to the point that I was making earlier about blunt use, because tobacco was involved in the use of blunt. So not only when we look at this as a social justice issue, not only are we talking about the cannabis industry, but we're also talking about the tobacco industry. And that's something that is very important and I think is often left out of the conversation, especially when it comes to Black people. So that was part of the reason why we did this study, just to see what's out there. So just focusing on the cannabis piece, even though we know all of this information and we hear all this information about Black people and cannabis and all this attention is paid to that space, when it comes to like arrest rates and kind of the negative end of things, when we looked at studies and particularly cannabis use treatment studies, we found no studies that had 100% African Americans in the sample, not one. And so we lowered the threshold to 60% and then found 7 studies. So again, just supports the need for more research in this area, especially when we think about all the disparities and all the attention that's been given to just that area. So it's just, disappointing to see that. So that disappointment actually led me to the Career Development Award that I currently have right now from NIDA. And I'm actually in the testing phase as we speak. So hopefully at a future CPDD meeting, I'll be able to present the results, hopefully great results from this intervention. But basically what you'll see is that it is a social support group based on Twitter. I did individual interviews. So this gets back to Dr. Jordan's point about making sure that the voices of the folks, our stakeholders, are included in the development of these interventions. And so they identified areas with which would be helpful for treatment. And so some of those areas included dealing with stress management and wanting to learn more about health effects, but specifically as it relates to blunts. And this is something that's really important that I want to emphasize here, because we talk about cannabis more broadly, but what I'm noticing is that particularly in working with young Black folks is that there needs to be and has to be a specific focus on blunts if we want to make any positive movements in this area. And so basically it's a 30-day social support group. There will be tweets that will be going out. They'll also receive encouraging messages either through text or emails, depending on their preference. to get information about blunt use and to make sure that they're participating in the intervention each day. So hopefully we'll have some good results from that. I'll share those in the future. But again, just really wanted to emphasize the importance of interventions like this. And another space that I wanted to discuss is that not only is our research important in thinking about ways in which we can ensure that Black voices are represented in our spaces, but also in the dissemination of research. And so I recently started a YouTube channel, and so it's very young, just a few videos that are up, but I'm encouraged because even with just the small number of YouTube videos that are out, I have received so many questions, so many comments, emails from people, especially young Black people, which is what I'm really trying to target in my work, asking questions, for example, about the blunt video. And, I didn't realize that we were being targeted by the tobacco industry. Tell me more about that. Or wanting to, like the studies that I'm citing in the YouTube videos, they're wanting to actually see our PubMed studies. Who knew, right? So, wanting to see this work. And so, and before then, like I said, I've been doing research in this space for a while. And before then, I had not received that kind of feedback in terms of wanting to learn more about studies, and particularly as it relates to blunts. So that's also just thinking about social justice and reaching the folks that we're trying to reach, and beginning to educate people about what's happening in the industry, and just helping Black people, especially young Black adults, to become a part of this conversation, because it's extremely important. And as you see, I also had Dr. Jordan on one, and that also has received a lot of views and a lot of comments. So again, this is just a great space, and I think it's something we have to think about as we think about dissemination of our work. So my social media handles are included here. So please follow me, follow back. And thank you so much again for allowing me to be a part of this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. That was excellent, and really just, I think, outward manifestation of ways in which we can conduct amazing, rigorous research, but also be able to translate to the key stakeholders, in your case, Black people who use cannabis through blunts. So I am just so encouraged by you, and have to say publicly, inspired by your work, which allowed me to really focus unapologetically on minoritized population. So with that, we'll end with Dr. Haney.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, a part of this workshop. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some approaches that I've used in my work for ensuring that Black people equitably benefit from substance use research as a way of addressing social justice. And so many of these approaches can be used for other racial and ethnic groups, but my focus has been mainly on the Black community. So I'd like to start with this quote by Angela Davis: "In a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist." And so being intentional about thinking how we can increase or ensure that Black people are equitably benefiting from substance use research, this is a way in which this is an approach that I take in engaging in anti-racist work in my research. So some approaches that I'm going to talk about include increasing representation, ensuring measurement invariance, or at least testing for measurement invariance, assessing constructs that are particularly salient to Black people, considering a strengths-based approach, and also, as has been mentioned, conducting community-engaged research. So one approach for increasing representation of people within substance use research is to conduct subgroup analyses. And so one example is using data from the Clinical Trials Network. We examined the efficacy of extended release naltrexone versus buprenorphine naloxone to treat opioid use disorder among Black adults. And in this paper, we did find, similar to the main outcomes paper, that there was no difference in the efficacy of either treatment in opioid relapse within Black adults. Another approach for increasing representation of Black people in substance use research would be to conduct moderation analyses when appropriate. And so one example is in one paper, we were looking at the efficacy of varenicline to treat co-occurring smoking and drinking among Black and white adults. And what we found in this study is that varenicline reduced smoking in both the Black and white subsamples, and drinking was reduced in the entire sample regardless of race. And so if So in this case, we did not find moderation by race. We found similar effects by race. If moderation by race was found, as Dr. Jordan mentioned earlier, it's important to keep in mind, or for subsequent research to examine how racism is contributing to these differences and attending to social determinants of health. Another way to increase representation of Black people in substance use research is to harmonize data. So one example is we harmonize data across multiple center across 2 center projects. And this led us to have a larger subsample, which allowed us to examine some preliminary analyses in a Black subsample. And so for this paper, we were looking at whether or not there were sex differences in the interactive effects of family history of alcohol use disorder and impulsivity related traits on alcohol outcomes, specifically alcohol use and consequences. And so when we looked in the combined data set, which is a majority white sample, we found that there were no sex differences in these effects. However, when we looked in the Black subsample, there was some evidence to suggest sex differences, suggesting that this should be replicated in a larger sample. It's also critical if you want to conduct race comparisons or look at moderation across race. It's for any latent construct that you're examining, it's imperative that you ensure that there's evidence of measurement and variance of that latent construct. Because as has been mentioned, it could be that the way that the measure was developed does not use language that represents or that's used to describe the construct across groups. And so if there isn't evidence of measurement and variance of a measure that you want to use for latent construct, it's highly recommended that you first investigate measurement and variance, which we did using the Barrett Impulsiveness Scale, specifically across Black and white adults with cocaine use disorder. In this study, we found that a brief version of the Barrett Impulsiveness Scale was invariant across Black and white adults with cocaine use disorder. So another approach for ensuring that Black people equitably benefit from substance use research is to investigate constructs that are particularly salient to this group. And so one would be, there's been extensive research on racial discrimination, but less so on socioeconomic discrimination in this group. And so we looked at the association between racial and socioeconomic discrimination and 2 stages of alcohol use in Black youth. And we actually found that social class discrimination was predictive of alcohol initiation, specifically among Black female youth, which highlights the importance of considering this construct in future research. Another example is to attend to racial trauma. So for example, in this study, we found that we found changes, a reduction in mental health symptoms, including racial trauma, pre and post using psychedelic use. And so I'm also leading a paper on using these data, examining a mediation of these effects, looking at whether there are changes in alcohol and other drug use, pre and post using psychedelics. And preliminary findings suggest that actually racial trauma mediates the association between acute psychedelic effects and reductions in alcohol use in this sample of participants of color. It's also critical that we consider a strengths-based approach. And so I just want to acknowledge the late Dr. Joe Wright, who was fondly known as the godfather of Black psychology. And I just remember seeing him speak and hearing him talk about, Black psychology. And, as Black people, not only have we survived, but we have thrived. And how have we done that amidst, given everything that we've had to experience historically and today? And so considering what are the strengths that Black people have that help them to, to move forward and to thrive. And so thinking from a substance use lens, thinking about treatment. We know that a large portion of people with substance use disorders never seek treatment, and yet they recover. And so this is a phenomenon understood as natural recovery, or self-change, as I like to use to attend to folks ascribe to the recovery language. So I got a pilot funds from the Learning for Early Careers and Addiction and Diversity program through UCSF to examine the process of self-change from cocaine use among Black adults, with the idea that this information may be used to inform how we can improve substance use treatment, existing treatments for Black adults, to enhance outcomes, retention, and satisfaction among Black adults. And finally, as Dr. Jordan shared earlier, using a community engaged approach can be really, really critical. And this can involve, in including people with lived experience in certain parts of the research, or using a full-blown community-based participatory research as Dr. Jordan described. And I'm super excited that some of my collaborators, including Dr. Jordan and Dr. Sherelle Bellamy, have set the stage for people with lived experience in the Black community in New Haven to come to us and share when they have suggestions or ideas for or research ideas for how we can make him, or how we can better support the Black substance using community. And so one idea is we did have one of our partners reach out to us expressing desire to address the need. And one thing that we're considering is utilizing the Sal Bonner Virtual Healing Circles, which was developed by the Association of Black Psychologists in the context of COVID and ongoing anti-Black racism. And conducting preliminary research, or collecting preliminary data to identify whether the Sal Bonner Virtual Healing Circles can support Black people who are in recovery in the context of COVID, or could be used as an adjunctive approach for Black people seeking outpatient substance use treatment. And so I'm super excited to be partnering with Dr. Jordan and our community partners in further studying this initiative. So these are a few suggestions or approaches that I'm using in my research that you might consider in your research as well. So I just want to thank you for your time and attention. I'm so grateful to be a part of this really important workshop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haney. I am so inspired by you. And I just want to say that when she was a postdoc, we came and we met, and she had all these wonderful ideas. And I just want to shout out her new race initiative. And it's the Race, Equity, and Addiction Lab at Yale. Real. She's keeping it real, and we are so grateful for those tangible examples that she gave in terms of how to promote racial and social justice and addiction. Thank you all for being here. We are so grateful for your attention, and we are inspired that CPDD took the step to have this webinar, and we hope that there will be many more like this to come. Thanks all.